Well, hi there. Today we're going to be talking about how to make cutout style illustrations digitally using Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, and ArtRage. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome. My name is Doodle Machine. Thank you for joining us for another artsy chat. Today we're going to be talking about cutout style artwork. I'm going to explain what cutout style is. I'm going to explain how I've used it in the past. I'm going to teach you how to make cutout style artwork digitally in vector programs like Adobe Illustrator and in raster art programs like Adobe Photoshop and ArtRage. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with a couple quick tricks and tips. Hope you find this interesting. Let's get into it. Let's start with, what is cutout style art? Cutout art really refers to art that's made of cut paper. There are different ways you can think about this. Either the paper can be found objects, so your cutout would have sort of a collage type feel to it, or cutout art can be much simpler, using plain colors or hand-painted textures, so you're not relying on any external found paper scraps or swatches. Cutout style art, whether it's done digitally or traditionally, usually has some element of making the illustration itself feel 3D. Not 3D in the sense that like the objects that are created feel like properly rendered 3D objects, but rather that the art itself uses the 3D space. And actually, I'm gonna stop referring to this as 3D. This is really 2.5D, because 3D art is usually meaning you're drawing something with perspective, like you're rendering it as if it exists in the 3D space of the scene that you're drawing or painting, like drawing a building. It's a 3D rendering of a real object in the 2D space. But 2.5D is a term that means that the image itself is two-dimensional, but some parts of the image are above or below others. And the parts above feel closer to the viewer because of the shadows they cast on the parts below. And this is the fundamental concept of cutout style art. I have a long history of cutout style illustrations. In the early days of me trying to find my style, I thought, maybe I would be one of these cutout style artists. I made lots and lots of traditional cutout style illustrations when I was exploring the different styles and figuring out kind of, what would be my jam. And I was pretty sure that cutout style art would be that. There was something about the whimsical nature of the cutout style that intrigued me. I always loved pop-up books when I was a kid, and one of my favorite artists of kids' books was Eric Carle, who did cut paper style illustrations. Doing cutout style illustrations just felt right to me. I mean, if you're making an imaginary world on paper, it kind of only makes sense that the scene and the characters gain a depth on the actual surface of the artwork itself. There's a bit of a magical feel to that. I did this for a long time in my early days. So long that when I abandoned this way of working, I was still in love with the general vibe and the whimsical nature that cutout style gave my stuff. I love those drop shadows and playing with the 2.5D space of the image so much that I kept the drop shadows and used them in my digital work and also my paintings. That's right, I would paint drop shadows onto my illustrations just to achieve this effect. I'm going to make a tutorial for that soon, for using painted drop shadows, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And even to this day, I still use the techniques of the cutout style. I do it without thinking. Almost every piece of art I do has some element thinking about how the objects interact in the 2.5D space and using light and shadow to push and pull them forwards and backwards. Let's talk about how to do cutout style artwork digitally. There are two main ways you can think about the cutout style. Either you think of it as a collage, which means you'll be using textures that you find and make to create the artwork, and it has a much more gritty kind of textural feel to it. Or you can think about the cutout style as using simple flat colored paper, and it has a simple, elegant feel to it. The method I'll show you today, it can be used for either style. The same techniques apply to both, so just keep that in mind. So let's get on to the demo. We're going to start with Adobe Illustrator, and there's something I should mention. We're going to be using a texture that I painted specifically for adding painterly effects to vector artwork. And I made a tutorial about this, and it's linked below. So check it out if you want to see me make this texture and explain how to use it. So let's get on to the demo. So here we are in Adobe Illustrator. I've already sketched out my scene. And one thing I find that's helpful is to make what I call a color sketch. I'll explain this more later, but basically the cutout style art, it generally works better to have light colors on top of dark colors. I usually do this where I make a little color sketch of my illustration before I start, just so I can kind of figure out all the big color decisions before I actually dive in. So let's get started. First up, I'm going to add a background color and texture. And like I said before, I'm going to be using a painted texture that I digitally painted in ArtRage, and I'm going to be applying that as a color filter over top of the various shapes that are in my image. So I'm going to put that on top of the background right now. There we go, that feels pretty good. I'm going to change the opacity because I don't need it so harsh. This should be a subtle texture. And now I'm ready to start drawing the actual shapes that I'm going to be using in the image. There we go. And because this is supposed to mimic a cut paper effect, I'm going to use the eraser tool and just kind of carve away the edges a little bit, just to give it a little bit of a gritty sharpness, as if it was actually cut out with scissors. There we go, that's my basic first shape, and I'm going to apply a texture to this shape in the same method that I used before. I just applied a mask to that texture so that it's the exact shape I want, and it's the same shape as the object that it is being applied to. There we go, I have the texture masked in exactly the right shape, and I have the object underneath. Now I'm going to group them so that they are one object. And before I apply any drop shadows, I'm going to go ahead and turn a few of the extra objects that we need into objects on the artboard. Drawing a few of these wormholes that this happy little worm has munched into this apple. That is a hungry worm. The reason I drew a green apple instead of a red apple is because I'm a green apple kind of guy. Granny Smith, that's my jam. I'm probably not going to bother adding a texture to these pieces as well, because they're going to be pretty minimal. You don't need to apply textures and drop shadows to every single part of your image. You want to pick and choose the parts that are most important. We're going to add this stem, sampling the colors I've already chosen from my little color sketch. And just like before, we're going to carve away at these shapes to make them look a little bit more cut out. And I'm gonna, just like before, go ahead and apply the texture to the pieces that I want them applied to. There we go. I have a couple basic shapes, and now here's where the magic happens. It is time to add some drop shadows to these objects to make them look as if they're pieces of paper on a two-dimensional surface that are raised up a little into the 2.5D space, and there's some sort of lighting that is casting a shadow on these. Now, there are two ways in Adobe Illustrator that you can add drop shadows. The first is with a drop shadow filter, and the second is by drawing on your own shadows. I'll show you the filter first. So I'm going to highlight this main chunk of apple here. I'm going to go to Effect, Stylize, Drop Shadow. So here's the window that allows me to change these settings for this drop shadow. You never want to stick with the default drop shadow. People who apply a quick and dirty drop shadow, they always use the default values and it never looks good. Don't do it. Choose your drop shadows carefully every time. You have control of your drop shadow in a few main ways. You can change the color of the shadow. You can change the opacity of the shadow, and you can change the blur of the shadow. And then there's also the position. You can move the shadow around. So the blur is how kind of soft the edge is of the shadow. So if I up this blur, so it's at 5 pixels now, if I set that at 20 pixels, you can see it adds a much bigger shadow. Now, what I like to do is I like to change the X value, that's the left and right value. I like to keep that at 0 because I like to picture my light is coming directly from above. But you don't have to do it that way. You can choose your light source, just make sure it's consistent across the illustration. Here I'm going to set the blur to maybe a 15 because I want this object to be quite far away, not as close as, say, the stem in the background. I'm gonna change the opacity on this one, maybe a 50. You know, you're just tweaking these values, kind of playing with things just to get that shadow just right and put it in the right position with the right opacity, the right blur. There, this drop shadow setting is just perfect for the kind of depth in the 2.5D space that I want this object to be. Now I'm going to apply a drop shadow to the leaf and stem in the same method. I'm going to make it much less of a blur though, because I want them to be a little closer to the actual paper that's in the background of this image. Oh, by the way, if you don't see a preview of your drop shadow while you're working, you can click this little preview box and boom, it applies the drop shadow so you can see it live as you make your changes. Okay, that feels good for me for the stem, and Illustrator has a cool kind of trick up its sleeve. If you want to apply the exact same drop shadow to another object, you click it and go to Effect, and instead of going down to the drop shadow from the Stylize menu, you can just click Apply Drop Shadow, and it'll use the exact same settings as last time. And say you want to edit a drop shadow after you've added it, you need to use your Appearance palette. So highlight the object that you want to edit. Let's say the shadow is too dark and too big for this object that I want. And then down in your Appearance palette, you have drop shadow. You can double click on that and you can change the settings to your heart's desire. Okay, so the way we're gonna add a drop shadow to this shape isn't using the drop shadow menu. We're actually gonna draw the drop shadow on. So you're gonna wanna use a black color and you're going to draw a shape of the shadow, keeping in mind that we're gonna be applying a blur to it, so it's gonna soften the edges. So let's just say we want this shadow to kind of come out around here. And the benefit to drawing your drop shadows on is you have complete control over every little aspect of that shadow. Some areas can be thicker and further away. Some areas can be closer to the actual object. You see here at the bottom underneath the little dip in his tail, I have it thicker coming down and it gets thinner as it goes up. So this is the object I'm going to be applying the blur to. So I'm going to stick that right behind his tail. And the way you apply a blur is you use a filter. We're going to go to Edit, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And just like applying the blur with your drop shadow filter, you can choose the radius of the blur here. And if you want to adjust the transparency, you would just use the transparency palette. That seems perfect right there. And we're going to set the opacity. I don't know, let's try 50. There we go. And there's something about the non-uniformness of this drop shadow that feels a lot more realistic to my eyes. When you apply one drop shadow to an entire piece, it has a very mechanical, computery feel compared to if you hand draw on your own drop shadows. It turns out way better. So we're going to use this as a base, and we're going to jump over to Photoshop because you can use the same technique in Photoshop as well. So here we are in Photoshop, and I have my illustration with my sketch ready to go, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to draw my shapes using the brush tool. I'm going to carve away at the edges using the eraser tool, and then we'll apply a drop shadow in the same way that we did in Illustrator. Drawing this illustration has really made me want an apple, and that's a bummer because I don't have any apples right now. I have bananas, but when you want an apple, a banana does not do the trick. Now we're going to carve away at this shape to give it that kind of handmade, as if it's cut with scissors effect. There we go, that feels pretty good to me. So the way you add a drop shadow in Photoshop is different than Illustrator. You don't have to use the menu. You click on the layer and apply it as a layer filter. So double clicking on this layer brings up the layer styles window, and I can apply a drop shadow right from this window in the same way that I did in Illustrator. And it's just right here, it's the drop shadow. And in Photoshop, the adjustments are a little bit different. You change the angle with this little slider right here. So I'm gonna have it coming right from above. We're gonna change the size, distance, and spread. That's just how far it is away from the light source, and the opacity, of course. Now remember, you wanna be subtle with this. Don't go adding these super dark, crisp drop shadows to every little object. Think about what to your eyes would make this image feel like a realistic 2.5D illustration where the actual pieces of paper are cut out and they're receiving light. They're at different distances. There we go. That's the one method. And in Photoshop, you can actually use the other method where you draw your own drop shadows, but instead of drawing a solid shape and applying a blur, you can just use the blurry kind of brush the way it is, the airbrush tool, if you will. Disable this drop shadow, and on a layer underneath this object, I'm going to use black and paint in a drop shadow using the airbrush. And if you're using a drawing pen, you can actually set the pressure sensitivity in the pen to adjust the flow on your brush, so you have a lot of control over how that shadow's painted in there. Now, what about the texture? The texture can be applied in the same way in Photoshop as it was in Illustrator. You can use a mask and you can mask your layer in very similar ways. I'm not going to get into that, but the reason that Photoshop is a great program to do this in is because it's a raster program and it has painterly style brushes. So you can actually use painterly effects in the program to paint right inside your shapes and add some textures right here in Photoshop. So I'm going to use some of my favorite textured brushes and just start experimenting inside this shape now that I have the transparency locked. There we go, that feels pretty good to me. Now I'm happy with the texture that I have inside here. You can use all sorts of brushes and painterly style effects, and you can work right inside the shape in Photoshop. And Photoshop isn't the only program you can use to do this exact technique. You can use ArtRage as well. So let's jump over to ArtRage. ArtRage has a couple tricks up its sleeve as well, so I'm excited to show you. So here we are in ArtRage, and the exact same technique. We're gonna draw the shape using the brush tools. I'm gonna carve it away using the eraser tools, and then I'll show you how to add texture inside. I might actually have to go to the store after I'm done this and buy a Granny Smith apple. All right, that feels pretty good to me. Sort of has a cut paper vibe to it. Now in ArtRage, the way that we're gonna add the drop shadow, it doesn't have a built-in drop shadow filter effect or even a layer effect like Photoshop, which is a good thing because it lets us paint our own drop shadows on, and the drop shadows always turn out better when you hand paint them yourself. So just like before, we're gonna set the color as black, and right now we're gonna use the airbrush tool in ArtRage. Okay, pretty standard airbrush settings. Make sure the drip spread is turned down or else you're gonna get a splattery kind of look to it. Unless that's what you're going for, turn that down, and let's paint on the shadow in the exact same way we did before. Here we go. I went for a bit less of a uniform shadow. I was kind of trying to think like if this is an actual piece of paper, some parts of it might be a little lifted up from the paper. So there's various levels of darkness. And I think the more kind of randomness you apply in your shadows, the more realistic it feels, just because shadows in real life aren't just a uniform thing that just, blanket, applies to the entire thing. So the way in ArtRage that you add texture to this now is the same as Photoshop. You're gonna lock the transparency. In ArtRage, you do that right over here. You highlight the layer you want, you click the little lock, and you lock the transparency. This will lock just the shape of the layer itself, and you can now paint inside. Now, the benefit to using ArtRage for this is that ArtRage's painterly tools are second to none. It actually looks like real paint. So I'm gonna experiment here. I'm gonna add some smudgy thick paint and see where it takes me. I'm gonna use the palette knife to scrape this around, kind of smudge it together, create some unexpected textures and colors. There we go. That feels rough and raw, very much like an actual painted texture that I would make and cut out and stick on this image. So ArtRage is probably one of the best programs for this just because it gives you those painterly tools to use right inside each of your shapes as you work. And back here in Illustrator, I brought over the objects that I made in Photoshop and ArtRage into my Illustrator document. I wanted to finish this in Illustrator, so let's see how it turns out. And there we go. We're going to call that done. And I think I achieved everything I wanted with the drop shadow effect. Let me know in the comments, how did I do with this one? Does it feel sort of like a cut paper illustration to you? Let's get into some tips and tricks. My first tip is to find or make the best textures that you can. If you're going to be finding textures online, keep in mind that you don't own the copyright to those textures. And by extension, you don't have the right to use them in your work. You might get away with it, but You might not. If another artist or photographer sees something they made or photographed used in your work, you might be in some hot water, legally. I'd say it's better to avoid that stuff entirely because it's so easy to make your own textures. You can do it digitally, like in my previous adding textures to vectors tutorial that is linked in the description below. Or you can find painted textures in the real world or make them in real life and take photos to use in your art copyright free. My next tip is to use the programs together. It's great to know how to use Illustrator to make cutout art. And it's great to know how to use Photoshop and ArtRage to make cutout style art. But things get really interesting when you learn to use them together. Illustrator is a vector program, and Photoshop and ArtRage are raster programs. And they each have their ups and their downs. If you want a explanation of the difference and benefits to each of raster and vector art, I made a video about that, and it's also linked below. You don't have to stick to one or the other though. Illustrator is great for creating documents that are organized and easily editable and contain vector data that can be used to print and scale to any size with perfect quality. Photoshop is an amazing program for editing textures and photos, adjusting the levels, changing and removing the colors, just to get that right effect, to make them just perfect. And ArtRage is my favorite digital painting program. It's so fun and easy to use. The paint feels like real paint. You can blob the paint on, you scrape it around and mix the colors right there on the canvas as if it's real paint. So I say just use them together. Create your artwork in Illustrator, for instance, but use Photoshop and ArtRage to work with or create your textures or paint swatches to use in Illustrator. Working back and forth between all of the programs at your disposal is how you'll get the benefits of all of them. Next up, we have the light on dark rule. And this isn't an actual rule. This is just a guideline that I follow when I'm choosing the lightness and darkness of my foreground versus the background. Generally speaking, with cutout style artwork, the drop shadows that you put on, they work better and they give more depth when you use light objects on top of dark ones. See in this example here, if the object is dark, then the drop shadow is also dark. And it creates a situation where the shadow doesn't make the image pop. Instead, it actually does the opposite. It sort of blurs and softens the edge of the dark shape with that dark shadow, and it ends up feeling flatter instead of the goal, which is to make it feel 3D or 2.5D. It's much better to use light objects against dark because there's already a contrast at the edge of your shapes where light meets dark, and adding a shadow to the light shape accentuates that light edge and really makes it pop in the 2.5D space. My next tip is don't use uniform drop shadows. It's tempting to use a type of drop shadow that works well in one situation and just reuse that on every object every time in your illustration or across illustrations. But that's boring. That's how your work will have that cheesy, generic drop shadow feel to it that you see all over the place, and it's played out at this point. What you want to do is choose each drop shadow with care, specifically for each object every single time. No two drop shadows should be alike. Some should be large and subtle, implying that the object that is shadowed is far away from the canvas. And some should be thin and dark and tight, which would imply that that object is close against another object, and the shadow that's created is making it pop only a tiny little bit, which is why it's a sharper shadow. Thinking about drop shadows and pushing and pulling things in the 2.5D space of the image is how you'll become a master of this cutout style art. And my last tip is to add highlights. So Authentic cut paper illustrations, they don't just have drop shadows, they have highlights on the tops of the edges of the pieces of paper, because they actually are pieces of paper. And you want to kind of try and mimic that if you want your stuff to be as close to the true cut paper illustrations. You'll need to think about how you can add a bit of a highlight to the tops of your shapes. You could add a crisp white edge, maybe not all over the place, but intermittently, to give the effect that these are pieces of white paper that have paint on them or printing on them that have been cut. You see this a lot in real collage-y kind of style cut paper artwork. Or you can add a subtle painted on highlight. There are lots of ways to do this. I won't bother getting into them, but this is how you can create cut paper style illustrations that are so realistic that they can fool people into thinking they're actually made of cut paper and they really exist in the real world, taken in a 3D or a 2.5D space. And that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, if there's anything I didn't address, if there's any suggestions you have for future technique discussion videos. I'd love to hear from you down there. And while you're down there, click the thumbs up button if you like the video. Click the thumbs down button if you dislike it. Subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. And as always, thanks for watching.